registered BC society that supports building more housing of all types in Vancouver and throughout British Columbia. Please head to our website to sign up for our mailing list and follow us on social media. It's great to see a full house. Thanks everyone for coming out, and to those watching on the live stream. We are gathering tonight on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This Thursday, there will be a talk about the Jericho lands at Robson Square. It is sold out, but you can join the wait list if you don't have a ticket. And it's going to be 3 liaisons from each nation. We'll be speaking about the cultural foundation at the heart of planning for Ialmaf, which is the old name of the Jericho lands. I said that in general, I know everyone at HV is really excited and grateful that the nations, together and individually, are taking a leadership role on housing in BC and in Vancouver especially. Thanks to Amanda and everyone at SFU for their hospitality tonight. Thanks to everyone who donated. The majority of the event is paid for, so that helps us put on more events in the future. Thanks to Jordan Ross Media for doing our live streaming tonight. So the format for tonight is we're going to have just a discussion basically based on the questions that were emailed to us ahead of time, and if we have time, we'll go to questions from the crowd. So Peter Waldkirch is our moderator for tonight. He's a Vancouver-based lawyer and a director of Abundant Housing Vancouver. He's currently working on an LLM at UBC Allard School of Law, where he's studying reforms by senior governments on municipal restrictions on housing supply. So he's the perfect moderator for tonight. For tonight's star guest, he has been the MLA for North Delta since 2017 and was named BC's Housing Minister last December. Previously, as the Parliamentary Secretary for Natural Resources, he championed the use of mass timber and innovation in BC's forestry sector. Now, as Minister of Housing, his focus is on delivering attainable, affordable housing options for British Columbians. He's also a two-time Olympian. He played field hockey for Team Canada at the 2000 and 2008 Olympics. So we're looking forward to a spirited and energetic conversation tonight. Without further ado, please welcome the member for North Delta, the Honourable Minister Ravi Kahlon.
Great. So I think we're going to launch right into the discussion. So again, thank you, Minister, so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone who's here. I want to especially thank everybody who sent in questions. As Owen said, rather than just sort of firing them off at the Minister, we're going to try and have a bit of a conversation. I've worked them into a conversation so that hopefully we can sort of drill into some things and try to balancing that, of course, with trying to hit as many of these topics as possible. So Minister, let's just launch right into it. We got a question from Clark Campbell, who said, when will your government bring the long-threatened hammer down on local governments that refuse or delay changes to the antiquated, inequitable, and unaffordable single-family zoning regulations that dominate residential properties within the communities in our province? Tomorrow has come and gone. The hopeless feeling of concerned citizens is spreading like a fast-moving cancer. And so we'll have some time to talk about policy, but what I want to focus on for this first question is that last comment about that feeling of hopelessness, which I think is a very real thing that's happening in our society. So many young people, renters, people from across the spectrum of our society feel locked out of Vancouver and our other cities, which are the centers of opportunity and the economic sort of life and so many aspects of our life in our province. So what would you as housing minister say to people who have this fear of their future and who do feel locked out by our housing crisis?
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. And first off, thank you, Paul, for being here today. You introduced me as a former athlete. Normally we warm up, we stretch, if you go straight into it, you pull a muscle, and I'm worried that I might do that today. But start with, I'll just say that I want to recognize that we're on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and that's a great question. Since I've been in this role, and prior to me being even elected, I mean, when I first got interested in politics, it was around housing. I was actually working in banking for a long time, and I remember just getting hired at the Royal Bank and people coming in. I remember this distinctly. There was 6 people that came in, all new immigrants, and they wanted to buy a townhouse. And all of their incomes combined with their down payment, they couldn't qualify. And had to tell them that they couldn't qualify for a townhouse. It was actually, you know, like that happens in banking, but for that one moment really hit me. And so for me, inequality has been an issue that's driven me in my work. But since becoming Minister of Housing, every single time I talk to people, it's always 2 kind of frames of conversation. The first frame is people saying to me, like, how am I going to be able to raise my kids in a neighborhood, let alone the neighborhood I grew up in, but in any neighborhood in British Columbia? So that's one category. And there's another category of people who have homes who say, where are my kids going to live? And how do I ensure my grandkids can live close to me? And so those are the frames of the conversation. It's actually not necessarily always those who have a home and those who don't. It's so complicated, and people really, I think, are at a place where the understanding is way greater now. And I know a lot of people in this room have been advocating for this for a long time, but I think the time is there where the public now is more alive to the need for this housing. Now, I get people in my community who say to me, you know what, we're a working class neighborhood. I don't want my community to change. I don't want my neighborhood to change. And what I always say to them is the same thing, which is the neighborhood is changing. The structure, the building structures might not be changing, but who can afford to live in the community is changing. I mean, if you don't have kids in your neighborhood anymore, your community is not strong. I mean, that should be the bar on whether a community is successful or not, is whether you've got kids growing up in it. Like, I grew up in a neighborhood, I was lucky, kids everywhere. It was a working class neighborhood, but you don't see that anymore. And so we're having conversations at the Vancouver School Board right now about selling lands that were for schools. Well, when are we going to have the conversation of why we're selling lands because there's no one in the schools? And so I think that the question is coming down the hammer on local government. And I would say that Premier Eby has been pretty clear with people, with local governments, that we need action. I've been pretty clear with my colleagues across local government that we need action. This last municipal election, I thought that there was the most amount of housing conversation that's actually happened at any local government election, and that was across the board. You know, that was famously said by a politician that elections are not the time to talk about policy. But this election, there was a lot of discussion about housing, what policies need to be brought forward, and I think that's healthy not only for our democracy, but also for advancing the conversation around housing. So that being said, we have legislation under the Housing Supply Act, which Premier Eby brought in, which allows us to choose 8 to 10 communities, make that public, identify what targets we're going to put in place with those communities for housing needs, identify how we're going to get there, not through spot zoning, but through large upzoning of large areas in order for us to achieve our targets. And the metrics we're going to use to decide those communities is 2 different frames. One frame will be communities that have the ability to grow, but normally those are the communities that have taken on growth. The second side will be communities who have hidden from growth. And that's important because I don't want it to be just communities that have taken on growth that continue to take on growth. This was a responsibility for everyone. And I say it often in Vancouver, it doesn't matter if you're Vancouver or Anmore. Everyone has a responsibility. And so how do we ensure that when we select communities that are part of the Housing Supply Act, the first ones, that you have both ends of the spectrum? And so that'll be coming later this spring. And we'll make clear to everyone what metrics we use and how we get there.
Lot to pick up on that. Maybe I'll just follow up on that right away. That is that a lot of housing sort of targets have historically been based off of historic population growth and then projecting forward from that. But that's obviously, it doesn't take too much thought to see how flawed an approach that is. If you've got 10 chairs and 20 people want to sit down, you add one chair. It doesn't mean you only need one more chair, right? And so I noticed that in the housing for people plan, there was a lot of talk about looking at high growth areas and stuff like that. So can you maybe expand on that, on how the government will be assessing housing need? I guess in particular, we've gotten a lot of questions dealing with what other jurisdictions are doing, like California, where they are taking quite robust approaches to assessing housing need that isn't based just off of projecting forward from a previously constrained past.
Yeah. Well, we are looking at other jurisdictions like California to make sure that how we assess is done in a way that's thoughtful and more encompassing. So not only looking at units, but what kind of units? Like we know that the needs are different in every community, and it can't be just on unit base. And so I can't go too much into the details on specifics, just because if I say too much, then people will start extrapolating what communities we're talking about, and because everyone here is very smart when it comes to this stuff. But I will say that not only will our decisions be made on which communities with data, informed by data. I'm not going to just wake up and say, you know what community pisses me off today. But so it's going to be data informed, but also we are very much looking at California. We're looking at what some of the things that are happening in Oregon, but across the board, New Zealand, on how they assessed housing needs. And again, we'll make that public in a few weeks.
Perfect. I think we're going to try and come back to some more of these detailed policies in a bit, but I want to take a step back, I guess, go back to some of these sort of higher level sort of thinking about these things. And so one of the things that's nice to hear in the current government's plan is sort of a square recognition that housing supply is an issue. Because when Abundant Housing Vancouver first got started in 2016 or so, the discussion, especially at senior levels of government, was very much focused on foreigners and on empty homes, right? There wasn't much discussion about just building housing supply. And you brought up this immigration story, which for me is one of the reasons why I got involved in this. My parents were both immigrants to Canada. My mother was a refugee. They arrived to Vancouver in the late 60s. When Vancouver was building the West End, when Vancouver was building the apartments in Kitsilano and Kerrisdale and Fairview and across the and they were able to find affordable rental housing, but that doesn't feel like it's possible for immigrants today. And so, for example, we got a question from Ashley Skye, who made more of a comment than a question, and she said, house the low incomes before you house the immigrants. So how would you respond to people like that and the role that immigration has in our housing policy and vice versa?
Yeah, I would say let's house everyone. It doesn't have to be housing one particular group before another group. And I appreciate the story that you shared about your family. I mean, when my parents immigrated here, we had 4 families living in one house. I mean, we're talking about small scale multi-units now, up to 4 units. Immigrant families have been doing that for a long time. And that's healthy, I think. It's healthy for communities, it's healthy for society. I grew up with aunts and uncles and grandparents, and I feel like I'm here because of those experiences. And so I would reject anything that suggests that one group, be left out of the equation. I think there's ways of doing it, but we have to have some really hard conversations. And we're having that here, but we have to have it with the public, broad public, because everyone wants housing. Everyone knows that we have a housing crisis, but nobody seems to want it in their backyard. Everyone knows we have a homelessness issue, but nobody wants it near their community. And at some point, we have to have conversations about how we address all these challenges and how do we do it in a smart way. Now, many people may know I've been an advocate on tying immigration policy to affordable housing units and to housing starts, because I think it's not only important for people that are here already, but it's really important for the people coming. We have a history in Canada of welcoming immigrants here, but not their skills, just them. and seeing them as cheap labor. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. My dad came here. He was a lawyer. He worked in a mill and drove taxis his entire life. And there's so many stories like that. And so my view is that we should have immigration. We should have solid pathways to immigration, but we should do it in a way that recognizes people's skills, but also set them up for success. And you can't set people up for success when they're coming here if you don't have adequate housing. We have international students here, 8, 10 people living in 1-bedroom suites. Like, how's that healthy for society? And so that's why I think that these putting these measures in place and getting the supply online is so important, because we want people that are living here to be successful, but we want people to come here, set up roots, bring their families, settle here, but be able to be successful along the way. And if you look at populations that are being challenged or falling into homelessness, sad to say that years of colonization have put Indigenous communities at the top of the list. But if you look at new immigrant communities, refugee communities, they're fast rising, as well as seniors, because of just sheer numbers. So just to circle back, I would say that I don't agree with the premise of the way it was framed. I would say that we need to find housing for everyone and do it in a way that's ensuring that housing is available where people want to live. And I know it sounds kind of like, oh, wow, magical and everything is going to be great. It's not going to be easy. It's not easy at all, but it requires these types of conversations happening in communities around the province.
It's really great to hear you say, this idea about letting people live where they want to live, because it seems like such a basic sort of idea, and yet Abundant Housing Vancouver, we're dealing with municipal housing policy day in and day out, and that's the exact opposite of what our housing policy is really built around. Our cities really treat housing as a threat. It seems like, where it needs to be tightly controlled and tightly regulated isn't even the right word. It's there's so many veto points designed to prevent it, which leads to a question that we got from Scott McDonald. So he asks, I'm going to get to the part I want to sort of ask you about sort of near the end of this question. Is the ministry aware of recent housing reforms in California? They're looking at precedents for what may be implemented in BC. These include the builder's remedy, prohibiting minimum parking requirements near transit stops, and detailed reviews of municipal housing plans to ensure they are ambitious, diverse, and not impeded by NIMBY councillors. So that's what I want to ask you about. We can talk about NIMBY councillors come and go, and there are some, but what I think a lot of us feel concerned about at AHV is that we kind of have a NIMBY housing system where it's not just the councillors, the entire machine seems designed to prevent housing and maintain the status quo in huge sort of swaths of our land geographically. So how does the province view the role of municipalities in creating today's housing shortage? And do you think they're going to be willing partners in helping to resolve it?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in that question. So I'll start with the first one, which is, are we learning from other jurisdictions? And the answer is yes. We're learning from other jurisdictions that if you have ambitious plans, that there's a lot of things that can be put as roadblocks to ensure that plan doesn't go through. And so parkings, setbacks, heights, all these things are what we've seen in other jurisdictions used by communities that don't want housing as barriers to stop that. And I always joke that if communities put as much attention and care into housing as they do for parking for cars, we wouldn't be in a housing crisis. We think about the cars more than the people in our neighborhoods, and so we really need to have some of those conversations. But for this, for example, the small scale multi-unit proposal that we've got part of the strategy. When we bring in legislation, we will be looking at how do we ensure that that there's not over emphasis put on more parking that's needed, that we're looking at setbacks. We're looking at what height requirements will actually allow for this type of housing to be built. How do we ensure that we look at frontage and use that as a formula of what type of housing we want? So those are all the pieces that we will be bringing forward in our legislation. And I know, and sometimes people say to me, well, this type of policy may not affect Vancouver much. Well, it will. It will, because, I've talked to too many builders who say, yeah, I'm allowed, but I, have to fight through every single loophole to get one project through. And so we want to make it simpler for everyone so that they have a clear understanding of what's required when they are going forward with these types of proposals, and what the minimums are. We want, our goal is to create as much certainty around as possible, and we're learning from other jurisdictions that have done this. Some jurisdictions, like California, said, here's where our ambition is, and you go away and you make your plans and come back to us. We don't have that type of time. Nobody has that type of time. We need housing like yesterday. And so we're going to be looking at how do we expedite processes that perhaps were used in other jurisdictions and learn from them about where the mistakes were without going too far sharing with what we're going to do.
That's great to hear. To sort of go back to that question about sort of the NIMBYism, which is, a bit of the elephant in the room sort of, right, where speeding up processes is important, and that's obviously great, but if it doesn't really change fundamentally what sort of housing can be built where, it seems like we're just going to be speeding up sort of the status quo, which in Vancouver is mostly the demolition of a house to replace it with another house, or the demolition of an apartment, displacing renters and replacing it with a slightly larger apartment. So, how does the province view sort of the role of municipalities as partners or not partners in this sort of mission to sort of that you're talking about?
Well, I think an important piece that I should say is that when I get asked about a single home being torn down, what should go there, my answer, and I'll same answer there and same answer here, which is, if people want a single family home and they can afford it, they will continue to be built. Right, the market's going to dictate what is going to come online. But the idea for us is, how do you ensure that, like the majority of people who can't afford that house, that there's other options available? And so my conversations with local leaders have actually been very positive. Nobody wants to be the one to make that hard decision, but they're all happy when somebody else does. And so, we hear in the media of some, but I guess blanketed is everyone, and I wouldn't say that's the case. I think that there's a lot of concerns from some local leaders that they don't want to be the only ones bringing on density when their neighbors are not doing it, when others are not doing it. And so I think that by us taking a provincial lens to this, it actually creates more social license for local governments to say, yeah, you know what, this is the way we want to go. Now, I'm not naive to think that there's not going to be some communities that are going to do everything they can to stop this. From the media reports, you'll already see a couple of them. And so, but we'll have to work with them, because in the end, everyone has that responsibility. But I would say that, to give people comfort in this room that are concerned about this, majority of local government leaders that I've spoken to, they get it. They understand the challenge. It's hard to be a local government leader. Like I every time I meet a mayor or city councilor, I always say thank you. And at first they were like, why is he thanking me? And I'm like, because it's hard. Like every day there's people coming to you and saying, this tree is so important to me, and this is happening in my community, and that car keeps parking in front of my house and it's pissing me off. Like those are tough issues to deal with, because they directly impact every single individual that comes to you. So that's why they struggle. But I think ultimately, in order for us to get the housing built and go to the core point that you're trying to make, is in order to get the housing built that we need, we have to depoliticize the process. We have to take away the politics of decision making, because as long as that politics are there, every single decision is going to be hard, like every single decision. And so that's why we changed the law to say that if a plan fits within the OCP, that you don't need to go back to council. I mean, that's why we did that, right? To depoliticize the process. Now, only some communities have taken us up on it. And we have to have a conversation with local governments to say, hey, this tool is there. But it's not because we want to avoid the public. We want the public engaged. You have to have the community engaged. We're saying just do it on the front end. Do that work. Work with your community to build a plan that ensures that everyone has the ability to be able to live in the community and have livable, vibrant communities. But once that plan is done, and that's the plan, let the staff deal with the rest of the pieces that come with it after. And so to the question, how do you work with local governments? I think that there's a sense of relief from some that the Premier Eby really has stepped up and said, hey, we're gonna do this. But also I think that initiatives like that around the OCP are things that we're going to be doing a lot more of as we go forward to help depoliticize the process and ensure that decisions are being made for the right reasons and not for whoever has the loudest voice. And often the loudest voice is always those who have the most power. That's always the case. And that's the case around housing conversations. People who have no homes, who are homeless or in encampments, who are new immigrants, are working sometimes 50, 60 hours a week. They don't have time for these conversations. People who have time for these conversations are usually those that, folks in this room who are like, hey, this is not fair, and those who have enough and have time to go against. And so we have to bring other voices into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. There's a really sort of, I think, a fundamental question about what the role, for example, of public hearing and rezoning is. Because the status quo seems like it's basically a veto point for new housing. And is that something that really, we really need for democracy? Or you hear sometimes these people saying these pretty outlandish things about this. And this is really kind of the origins of Abundant Housing Vancouver, was really some renters getting together and realizing that these public hearings are being dominated by extremely unrepresentative groups. So I think there's a lot of thinking to thought to be done about this. So, but let's go back to, I want to talk about Vancouver a little bit. You sort of alluded to this idea that maybe the reforms that have been proposed so far by your government aren't going to do much for Vancouver. We got a question just like that, several questions in fact. Josh asked, why does your plan not address issues in Vancouver? That's an exact quote.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Josh, for that question. Well, I would say a couple things. First, when we make policies, we don't make them just for Vancouver. There's a big province out there, and we have to make sure that that any policies we bring encompass small communities, big communities, and bring that lens. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing would be, I reject the question because this does impact Vancouver. Last I read, some of the policies that have been advanced around having fourplexes and et cetera are not Vancouver broadly. They're only parts of Vancouver. Some parts of the community are not taking any of these additional housing units. And so what we're proposing is not only Vancouver, but across the province, all communities be able to take on these types of housing units to have accessible units available for people. So, but this is just one piece of it. The small scale multi-unit was the piece that we knew was going to get the most attention. It clearly is. I mean, I go in the legislature and I hear the opposition parties talking about, we're going to destroy communities and what about parking and all this stuff. Like, we knew this was going to elicit that type of conversation. But there's a lot of pieces in that strategy that's going to impact Vancouver. When we talk about transit-oriented development, Vancouver is going to see a lot of transit-oriented development because we highlighted in the strategy that there's going to be additional units around transit. There's going to be additional housing built around frequent transit areas. And so there's going to be pieces that come this fall that will have actually significant impact on Vancouver, but it'll be more connected to transit. Given that Vancouver has the most accessible transit, they are overwhelmingly going to see more of that, of the changes when it comes to that as well.
it's interesting you mentioned that because we definitely got a lot of questions about that. In the plan you've released so far, there's sort of one brief mention of this, additional density permitted in areas well served by transit. So we got several questions about this, including from Russell, who's in the audience not today. I saw him earlier. Anyways, he asked about if this was going to be related to New Zealand's approach, where they have they basically allowed 6-story or 3.0 FSR apartments within walking distance, which is 800 meters to about a kilometer, of a rapid transit station. And he notes that the Federal Housing Accelerator Fund suggests making 10 stories legal by right within 1.5 kilometers. So I'm wondering, I know you can't get into details, but I guess I'm wondering if you could comment on that. But also, Russell also followed up with this. What is meant by transit in this station, in this context? Is it only SkyTrain stations, or is it TransLink's fast and frequent bus network? Or if you can provide us with anything, because this seems like the one concrete piece that could really make a difference in Vancouver.
Yeah, no, first off, it's great to hear the federal government has this in a plan. I'm looking forward to them bringing it in. You know, so maybe take a step back. Around SkyTrains first, you know, there's been a policy in place for, I don't know, 50 years in the province, that when a transit station is being proposed and built, that the province is not allowed to buy any additional land other than the land required just for that station. Now you think about it now, you're like, what the heck were people thinking, right? Why wasn't this, like, it seems just so obvious now, but this has been the policy for a long time. And so we've just changed that. And now the Ministry of Transportation is able to buy land around transit stations, future transit stations, within 800 meters. In fact, part of the strategy is us doing that very thing. Gives us the ability to do things like, you know, build schools before we develop the community, you know, healthcare and all those, childcare, all those pieces, but also to build truly affordable housing around transit, which we know is where it is needed the most. So that's one important piece, which is kind of the SkyTrain network or the train networks. And then there's also where you have transit coming, I'd say 15 minutes. 15 minutes is usually how TransLink defines it, and the buses are coming within 15 minutes. So for us, I think that when we think of transit-oriented development, we're looking at both SkyTrain opportunity, but also where transit is coming frequently enough, where we think that we can get more housing been built and encourage more people to get out of their cars and of course live around transit, build their lives around transit. And quite frankly, that's where the world is going anyways. Like I have friends who visited me from Singapore, this is now 6 years ago, and I was taking them to a Whitecaps game. And so we started at Scott Road Station, you know, where I get on the transit. And so we came all the way in. And I think we got just past Kingsway, and they were like looking out the window, and I'm like, what's up? They're like, can we just stop and go for a walk? And I was like, why? They're like, how is it that you have a train station stopping here and you have single family homes everywhere? Like, they're like, this is just bizarre to us. Yeah. And so we got out. We went for like a 15-minute walk. They were just, I don't know if they weren't impressed. They were amazed. They were amazed at like how that's possible. And so, and I use that example as in not to target one specific area of any community, but more so to say, you know, we just haven't done the type of development, the thoughtful development that we need when it comes to transit. And so that's what we're alluding to. And again, more details will come this fall. This fall, we're going to be very busy because a lot of the pieces we're talking about will require legislation. And our goal is to have most of it this fall.
It really is shocking as sort of the state of some of these sort of so-called transit-oriented development here in the city of Vancouver. I think it was just today in council, they were hearing a proposal to rezone about 200 lots in the Cambie corridor to townhomes, which is great. Townhomes are fantastic, but these are spots within walking distance of a SkyTrain station. And in the context, that sort of small scale housing in some places might be called for, but in the city of Vancouver, given the depths of our housing shortage, it seems like quite an underwhelming sort of proposal for the use of land. So that's what I think a lot of people here are sort of hoping for, that the province, I understand you can't get into details, but we're hoping that the province is going to be ambitious there.
Yeah, and you know, again, a lot of this is Premier Eby's vision, and so it's actually being the Minister for Housing is a tough file, but it's actually a pretty awesome file when you have a premier who's kind of like, hey, come on. Like, have you done this yet? I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. So I think that, and we also have a Minister of Transportation, Minister Fleming, who really understands us. His team really understands the opportunity of building housing around transit. And so we're working very closely. There's not a silo. The teams are working collaboratively. And again, more details to come. I know you're doing your best Peter, to get it out of me, but that's as far as I can go on it.
Well, maybe we'll take a step back then, and instead of talking about specific policy, go back to sort of some high level ideas, because I'm curious what you said about the province needing to treat every jurisdiction the same. It seems to me that Vancouver, the city of Vancouver especially, is a bit unique, though, compared to, the housing need here is not the same as in many other communities. The role that Vancouver plays in the economic life, in the job life, in the educational, the social, the artistic life of the province is not the same as many other places. And so, we were talking about New Zealand's housing proposal. Their federal government, which it's a unitary government, so they're kind of the role of the province when it comes to cities, is they initiated in 2010 the Auckland Unitary Plan process, which was a sort of a comprehensive plan for Auckland. And in their planning documents, they squarely recognize that in the 21st century, a region, the jurisdiction's leading municipality has a special role to play in attracting talent and attracting and retaining capital and all this. And so that there did need to be a special focus on Auckland compared to other regions and other cities in New Zealand. It squarely recognized that Auckland's success would be New Zealand's success. And so I'm wondering if the province has, if your government, if you can say anything about the government's thinking about the role of Vancouver, the city of Vancouver especially, in the sort of as the epicenter of the province's housing crisis, and what you view its role in the future of housing supply in the city, in the province.
I would say that that the people of Vancouver would say rightfully that Vancouver needs a special attention. And people of Surrey will tell me the same thing. And Burnaby will tell me the same thing. Port Quillam will tell me the same thing. They're all unique and an important part of our province. And so, but I hear you. People that I deal with at the local government level say, well, we have a Vancouver charter, which makes us special. And it's true. The Vancouver charter is different than everywhere else. So there are opportunities. But I would say that we're not going to propose something that is Vancouver distinct. And so it's better to say that straight up. We are going to be doing policies that are going to impact the province. But that being said, I'll say it again, that when we're talking about transit-oriented development, it will be disproportionately Vancouver, given that Vancouver has the majority of the transit accessibility. Now, there are opportunities beyond just the policy pieces. We know, for example, one of the things that I don't think got enough attention, but I'm really excited about is the BC Builds. We can learn from other jurisdictions like Vienna, for example, right? Where social housing is not the way we think of social housing here. Social housing is targeted to the middle income families, middle class families, and providing housing for those who are lower income. And so I think there's an opportunity with BC Builds using government lands to build truly affordable housing for people and build vibrant communities around it. And I think there's opportunities for Vancouver to get a disproportionate benefit just given the population numbers. And there's a whole host of other things within the plan, I think, that will benefit Vancouver more so than anywhere else. But I think when the plans come out this fall and some of the transit-oriented development stuff becomes more clear for folks, I think it'll be clear. And then, of course, if Vancouver gets chosen as one of the communities part of the Housing Supply Act, then Vancouver will get a lot of special attention, and I think in a positive way. But again, too early for me to say which communities will be part of that.
Fair enough. I guess when I talk about Vancouver's unique role, I'm not meaning sort of special in some metaphysical sense or in terms of my feelings or my heart, but there is an element of housing demand here that is just a fact that is not present elsewhere in the province. And so I'd like to talk about Sanok for a moment, because I think that's a great demonstration of sort of the housing demand that exists in this city. They will be building housing there on a scale that just a few blocks away right now in the city of Vancouver, in Kitts Point, they're going to be tearing down a 3 or 4 story tall apartment and replacing it with 3 houses. That's the only thing the zoning allows. So that gap between the city only allowing a detached house, when a couple blocks away they're building, when they're freed from those restraints, they're building 40 story tall towers. That scale of that's really a striking example of just how restrictive the city's housing policies are, and the depth of the unmet housing demand that exists there, which isn't just it doesn't exist everywhere across the province. And so I guess if you want to comment on that, on the role of Sanok and sort of what it says about the state of the city's housing policies.
Yeah. Well, I love the Sanok proposal. I think that it's bold, it's ambitious. We've been in conversations with MST around their vision for not only housing their people, but housing people across the province. The designs are beautiful. Like, I can sit here the entire time and talk about how great I think the proposal is. And so to your point about, if that is so great, then I'm beating you to your next question. Then why can't we do it more places, right? So, okay, see that? I knew where you were going to go. So, there is a fine balance between us wanting to get the housing we need and also ensuring that there's respect for local governments, and we're trying to find that balance. And I appreciate the small scale multi-unit was a big push, given that 80% of our land base is still single family dwelling zones. And so somebody did ask me the other day, why start there? Why push the boundaries on something that affects so many people? Because I think it's important for us to have that conversation with everyone. And now everyone is part of that conversation. Everyone wants housing, but not everybody wants it in their backyard. And so how do we have that conversation? And I think fundamentally, when you go to people and you move away from this conversation about density and units, all that, to the core, I think what people universally agree on is we need homes for our young people. We need homes for our young families. We need homes so that grandparents and grandkids can live close to each other. And so that's what you'll hear me saying a lot of. And how we get there, I think it's going to be an evolving conversation. And I'll give you an example. Like, I was pretty vocal about the Broadway plan. And encouraging council to let development happen at the rate the development's going to happen at. They've got very strong rental protections. I don't think any other jurisdiction in North America has got that type of protections for renters built into their development. But my message to the mayor and his colleagues was that the boring machine below ground better not move faster than the development above it, or we have some major issues. So I think they landed in a good place, but it's things like that, where we can't make decisions and then relitigate those decisions. That nothing frustrates me more than talking about decisions that have already been made and thinking about them, whether that we're right or not. We got to make decisions. We got to move. And when you do that, yes, there'll be some bumps along the way, but it's the only way you can manage through a crisis, which we're in. And so, we're going to work with City of Vancouver. We're going to push, kudos to Mayor Alto in Victoria. I think Mayor Alto showed some really strong leadership over there. I know it's a Vancouver crowd, but those of you that are watching from Victoria, I think Mayor Alto deserves a lot of credit for being bold and coming forward with a vision and really talking to her community, engaging on it. And I encourage Mayor Sim and the rest of the council to be bold and to be leaders in this conversation, and where we can, we will be nudging them forward to make sure we have the housing we need.
Well, let's talk about renters then for a moment. We know from experience in Vancouver, from the streamlining rental policy, which was an incremental policy that was incredibly sort of contentious and took many, many days of public hearing to enact and so forth. But we know from that 4-floor rental apartments are probably not economically viable in the city of Vancouver, where in single family lots. They're allowed in some of these transition areas in them, but there's only been 2 or 3 proposals in the over a year this policy has been announced. So we kind of know that 4-floor apartments, the ship has already sailed on that for terms of creating new rental housing. So given your government's focus on small scale housing and sort of the lack of action so far about apartments in the city of Vancouver that are taller than, that are 4 floors, let alone taller, it seems like there's not much in this plan for renters who are facing a 1% vacancy rate. So does the government have any plans or thoughts on increasing the rental supply in the city of Vancouver?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying that if you look back at the history of how many rental units have been built in this province, and let's say go back 10 years, you'd see 3,000, 4,000 every year. And we're at like 14,000, I believe, last year, 14,000 the year before. So we have seen a significant increase of rental units under construction. I'm worried about rental construction, given interest rates, where they've gone. And a lot of rental projects now are not viable under the new conditions. And so this conversation that we're having here is a conversation that is already happening at the local government level. Maybe not at the pace that I'm happy with, maybe you're happy with, people here are happy with, but the projects as they're being proposed from 2 years ago are no longer viable. We're going to need additional units, FSR, in order for them to be viable. And if any local government thinks that's not the case, then we have a bigger problem. Because the market has changed fundamentally, and so I've heard the CMHC program has been helpful for some to get the rental units on board, but we're going to have to find ways to make these projects more viable. And really the 2 ways, well, 3 ways, I guess, is one is DCCs and CACs. Second is, considering additional density to make them more viable. Or third is getting them approved faster, or all 3. And so those are conversations that I know that are happening. Certainly we're having them about how we can help incentivize that. But I would say Vancouver in particular needs to have that conversation, given the amount of proposals that are in the process now. And this also goes to the fundamental problem, which is if you're waiting 5, 6, 7, 8 years to get approval of a project, like how do you even project what project will be viable over that length of time when things change so much? Like just this last year, the change with cost of building and interest rates, all these things has knocked a whole bunch of projects offline. And so we need to address the speed of approvals as well. I'm not sure if that's in your questions, so I'll just segue myself into it. I was the Minister for Economic Recovery prior to this role, and I had a chance to travel to 5 countries. So I did a 10-day 5-country trip. Don't do it. Don't ever do it again. I will never do it again. But we got a chance to go to Netherlands, London, and then Dublin. Then we were in Germany, and then Finland. And in Finland, we were going there for shipbuilding mostly. But I got to meet with some local officials around housing as well, because they're doing a lot in tech space. And the local government official told me that if they don't approve high-rise projects within 3 months, there's a riot in the streets. 3 months. And I was like, I welcome that problem, man. Imagine that, 3 months. And the way they do it is through technology. They've got end-to-end digital processes so that when a project is developed in a 3D model, it doesn't have to be put in print form and submitted to local government for 40 teams to look at individual paper copies with probably 40 people who can veto it. And then somehow we wonder how projects are not getting through in a timely way. And so City of Vancouver is doing some good work right now on looking at how that can change. Kelowna is doing great work. There's many communities that are looking at it. But I think that part of our strategy is going to be around digital reform. How do we get to automatic code compliance checks and really digitize the process? Because I think it's going to do two things. One, it'll move projects, get them approved faster because a lot of it will be automatic, right? I mean, you know, the technology exists. I'm not saying create new technology. It already exists. Singapore is using it. Estonia is using it. Finland's using it. How do we make it work within our context? But I think what it also will do is it will help simplify our understanding of the laws and bylaws and other things that we put in place. Because for code, you need A or B. You can't have that gray area of like, if you've got that in there, the system won't understand it. So that I think will give us the ability to look at some of these things and say, you know, this is not clear enough. There's not enough clarity in this. Can we find ways to create more certainty in that? When we use that process, I think we're going to be able to create more certainty in the process for proponents coming through, and also for the public, so they know that this means either this or that. And if you've done this, your project fits. That might take some time, but I think the digitization process will force that conversation in ways that perhaps some people think it's not that important now.
I want to pick up on that, but I also want to sort of go back to something you said a moment ago about sort of the rental apartments. There's another option, of course, which is to expand where apartments are allowed to be built, which, you know, since the first plan in Vancouver, the Bartholomew plan in the 20s, sort of it seems like planning has been obsessed with tightly restricting where apartments are allowed, and then in order to preserve vast geographic swaths of the city from all change. And we know one of the products of this is renter displacement, is because the only place you're basically allowed to build an apartment is on top of an older apartment. And so we got a question from Heather, for example, about how you will protect tenants who are now living in affordable rentals.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, but if I can just add one thing. I'm sympathetic to many arguments that people make because, you know, people come from different places and everyone has legit concerns. Fear of renters, I just don't get. I just don't get it. Like, you know, we changed the rules to allow young families to be able to move into strata buildings. And then we have people changing the rules on people who are having a child, and so when they have a child, then they get kicked out. Like, I just don't get and understand the fear of renters. And so to your question earlier, why are we restricting it to certain areas? I don't know. It makes no sense to me at all. So that's the first question. To the second, you know, we are really concerned because we're bringing on like historic level investments to build units. The problem we have is that it takes 5 years to build the units. So you bring in the investments in, it takes time for those units to be built and get online. But the bigger problem we have is you don't want to be losing the same amount of units you're building at the same time as yours. So that's what the rental protection fund is really important. It's $500 million. You know, when we first launched it, the Premier said that we're doing this, you know, we heard from people saying, well, it's going to create more competition in the market. It might mean prices go up. Why would somebody sell it to BC not-for-profit housing or co-op or Aboriginal Management Housing Association when they can sell it to the private sector? All those things have been false. We have a lineup of landlords saying we would rather sell it to the not-for-profit folks because we know there'll be protections for the people that live in the building. We have a lineup. We even have REITs lining up and saying, hey, we've got some older projects. We don't know how we're going to make them viable, and we would like to sell it. And then there's been a domino. I had a meeting with the minister from Quebec who said, hey, we want to do the same thing. And we're going to see a domino across the provinces to do this, because fundamentally we're all dealing with the same thing. We're trying to invest in new housing, but we don't want to lose the affordable units along the way. So that's one, I think, clear way that we're doing it. You know, the changes we made around rent evictions, I mean, rent evictions were the main conversation a year ago. Now I talk to the housing advocates, those are advocating for renters, and they say, you know what, we rarely get cases on that. But now the issue has moved somewhere else. And so we're still finding ways to put better protections in for renters. But, you know, part of our goal here is to get a lot more rental units on board, but just all units as well. Again, the small scale multi-units, I know it's small, but, you know, we're going to be able to see units come along throughout the province in all communities, and that will take pressure off bigger communities as well.
Going back to the technology sort of part of what you're talking about, I guess one concern is that, you know, if we just speed up the process, you know, we're just speeding up a broken status quo without really rethinking. So I'm encouraged by the idea that, you know, what you're saying about using technology as an opportunity to think about how we, you know, what we're actually asking for from new housing, how we approve it. But we got a question, for example, from Owen asking about mass timber. So he notes the province has been doing a lot of work to encourage mass timber, but he notes that in the city of Vancouver, there isn't really any zoning that is suitable for mass timber buildings, 12 to 18-story apartments, which is sort of one of the sweet spots for mass timber. There really isn't any zoning in the city of Vancouver that sort of that allows that. So more generally, Owen continues, there's a lot of talk about different technologies like prefabrication, but there isn't the zoning in place that would allow for the mass production of housing anyways. So he asks, how do you see zoning and technology being coordinated so that companies feel comfortable investing in the scale that will be required so that they know there's a market for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that, Owen. We're right now working with the National Research Council on aligning our building codes to, in a safe way, be able to support more of this type of development. BC's always been a leader in this space, but we have more work to do. Quebec has been an interested partner. So BC and Quebec are leading this conversation right now. And we're looking at, so the question is about zoning of land, and I'm going to take it more to the code side to be, to make it easier for this type of construction to be done. Like, I'm a mass timber geek. I'm just like so convinced that this is part of the future. And not only because I was in the forestry file before, actually partly because I was in the forestry file before, but, you know, just the ability to get more value from our forest products, create good manufacturing jobs. But really, what I've been saying to the development community is either you're going to pay a little bit now or you're going to pay a lot more later to learn how to build more sustainably. Because this train is coming, whether you like it or not. Now, you look at communities like North Vancouver, who are leading this space. They've got so many mass timber projects coming on board. You talk to the mayor, Buchanan there, she'll tell you that not only is it because it's better for sustainability, you know, embodied carbon's lower and all those important pieces, but also it's less noise, right? Because all the cutting is happening off-site. It's less disruption to local businesses because there's less trucks coming on. And so they're getting all the pieces that they want, and it's faster development, like half the time to get these buildings up. And so I think that prefabrication has to be part, whether it's mass timber or other types of prefab, it has to be part of the future because, you know, what are we doing, 24,000 units a year? Like, we got to get into 35,000, 40,000 units to be able to sustain the population growth that we have. And we don't have the skilled workforce to be able to do all those things. So we have to rethink how we build. And so that's why I'm so convinced that we have a company called Intelligent City in Delta, which is which will house their first building in Vancouver. I believe it's on Heather Street, which I think it's 12 stories, which will be completely done in their facility in Delta, all with robotic arms. There's not a person touching this thing except for building the robotic arms. If they are successful, it's going to be game changing. It's going to be game changing for investment in that company, but others that are in this space, because we're going to be able to build these things offsite, bring them on, and put them together like Legos. And I don't want to sell people like this is like fake stuff. This is happening. This is real, and it's going to move much faster. I'm convinced that in a few years that's going to be a bigger piece than it is. And I know, for example, from Indigenous communities, they see a historic connection to this type of housing. And so we're going to see more Indigenous-led projects in this space. Because it's a win-win for Indigenous communities, and yeah, I mean, I could spend a complete hour on this topic, but it's going to be very important for us going forward.
I think a lot of people would agree that the opportunities by the technology is very exciting, but at the same time, I think a lot of people who support Abundant Housing Vancouver would say that the housing is fundamentally we're in a policy failure situation, not as much a technological failure situation, right? The housing shortage wasn't caused because we didn't know how to build enough homes. It's because we outlawed the sort of homes that we were building in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and made it so that you simply weren't allowed to build those homes anymore. So take a mass timber home. If we had magical technology that allowed us to snap our fingers and SimCity style drop a 12-floor mass timber apartment somewhere in the city, that would not make a difference in the city of Vancouver today, because that building would simply be outlawed. It would be illegal for that building to exist almost anywhere. So I guess, do you have any, the opportunities by technology are exciting, but only if there's a policy world in which that's feasible. And of course, companies are only going to invest in this if there's a policy world in which that's feasible. So I guess, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I would say that you're correct on the policy piece, that it's, generations of policy that have precluded certain type of development in some places. But I would say that that's the beauty of innovation. Innovation thrives in areas where there's restrictions and they need to find ways to get around it. And so I would say that there's both. I think that there's room for innovation and there's room for policy. And when you're so far behind, we're 2 decades behind in investment in housing. I mean, 2 decades of lack of investment in housing has put us into where we are. Like, if you look at the goal that the CMHC set for how many units need to be built, and you go back and count how many units would have been built in 20 years if those investments have been made, you've got your number right there. And so, yes, policy, yes, financial resources, but we just don't have enough skilled workforce as well to build the level of housing we need. So we need that level of technology and innovation as well.
We did receive a question about that. Kay Jiang asked if you could provide more information about the BC Builds program and how you intend on expanding BC's construction workforce. Well,
I go back to the first point, which is, I'm a strong proponent of immigration. We need to allow people to come here and actually use the skills they have. And so that is going to be an important part of how we address some of the labor shortage we have, especially around construction. But we also need to ensure that people here get the skills and opportunities they have. When I was young, much younger than I am now, I remember, saying to my family, I wanted to be a teacher. And my parents were like, no, you can't be a teacher. You gotta go into business, you gotta go into all these things. And my, other family members wanted to go into trades, and they're like, oh no, you can't go into trades, you gotta go to business. And there was a psyche, this mentality that you can't go into trades. And I fast forward now, that psyche's still there now. And quite frankly, I remember saying to my dad many years ago, I wish you would let me go into trades. Man, I'd be making so much money right now. And that's the case now. So I think that we need to ensure that we remove barriers for people. Like, skills training is the most important economic question that we have as a jurisdiction. We got to increase productivity. We got to ensure our workforce, all of our people have as much knowledge and skills as they possibly can. But we need to do that to address the housing crisis. We need to ensure that we have immigration policies that allow it, and we need to ensure that we also are building differently. So building in ways using technology and innovation to reduce the need for the amount of people as well on site. So it's going to be all three of those pieces, I think, going forward.
My dad's German, so I definitely recognize comparing my cousins and so forth that are growing up there and the different experience they have with the training and the respect that trades have. It's a night and day difference, and it's something that I think that we could use a lot more of in our society for sure. You mentioned the CMHC targets. They have estimated that BC needs about 1 million net new homes by 2030 to achieve better affordability. That's including their business normal situation plus the extras. Your government has set a goal of, I believe, 114,000 new or under construction homes by 2028. So there's still a gap there. But my question is sort of about accountability. What will happen if in 2025, 2026, 2027, we are not on goal? Is your government prepared to keep on top of this and to respond as needed to ensure that housing production reaches the levels we need it to?
Yes. Just kidding. The answer is yes. My frustration around the 1 million is it's great to put a number out there, but we need some action to get to that number. And so the 114,000 we set was through direct builds, through partnership with private sector, and through policy. Like the spec tax, for example, brought 20,000 units into the housing market, and that's CMHC backed. Just by telling people that, hey, you can't buy homes and just leave them empty, like novel idea. And 20,000 units came to market. And that's only in a limited area that we brought that in. Part of our strategy will be expanding that to bring more units on board back. We're going to be looking at short-term rentals. We got to find ways to get some more short-term rental units back into the housing market. And so you'll see us take step on that. Now, some people say, well, you got to focus on just building new units. We got to focus on both, because building 20,000 units would be in the billions of dollars. One policy change brought 20,000 units back into the market for us. So we got to look at both. And that's why we're trying to, bring the policy pieces to push the numbers, but also directly building as well. And that's why BC Builds is going to be important, because to truly build affordable housing, you need to address the land question. And government has land. Yes, some land has to go through discussions with Indigenous communities. We're going to do that. But gone are the days where government sells lands. Like there should be mutinies when government sells land. I look back now and think of all the land that was sold to private developers over the years at the cost it was sold at, and I think it's treasonous, quite frankly. And so those days are gone. So the question now is, how do we use public lands to build truly affordable housing for not only low-income earners, but also the middle class? And that's going to be a key part of how we move forward as well. Okay.
We're running short on time. There's one more question I need to ask you, and it's about the recent so-called sweep that we've seen on Hastings Street. I think most people agree that the camps are not safe nor dignified housing. And yet, Oppenheimer Park was decamped in 2014, and it really feels like we're in a cycle. Some other jurisdictions have made real progress on homelessness by adopting housing first policies, but it feels like here we're in a cycle. And so what can you tell us about why we should think that anything is going to be different this time, and we're not just going to be having the same conversation in 1 or 2 years with another decampment or clearing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the situation that and this is a North America question. I know we are focused on Vancouver and BC, but when I was traveling through, I was in the Bay Area, and I saw just every road covered with RVs. because all the people that work in the tech sector can't afford to live there, so they're all living in RVs. In Seattle and Portland, encampments everywhere, all across the country. This is a major issue coming out of the pandemic. And so, you can't equate this challenge to other challenges. We brought 1,400 supportive housing units on last year, and we still have people in encampments. And so, and the reason why, especially around the downtown east side, no government leader ever says, I will step up and take responsibility, is because it's going to be hard. This is not going to be an easy solution to deal with how we get everybody housed. We have SRO units that are sometimes 100 years old buildings. There's, I think, 90 SRO buildings, 60 of them are privately held, 30 are publicly held. And not all SROs are bad. Some of them are in decent condition and are an important part of the housing stock. But we've got units that have been old and no one invested in them for a long time. So the challenge is overwhelming. And the reason why Premier Eby said we're going to take responsibility is because that's the first step. Somebody needs to step up and say, hey, this is embarrassing for us as a province, and we need to step up and take responsibility. So that's the first step. And then what we did was we developed a strategy over time. Now, Mayor Sem made a decision because public safety is his responsibility. I agree with him that the encampments were not safe. I mean, not only for the people living there, for the community at large, we almost lost a couple of SRO buildings because of fires from outside burning up, which would have put a lot more people displaced, a lot more people. And that being said, we have made significant investments to get people indoors. We have approximately 100 supportive. So just to back up, there's about 70 to 100 people that were on Hastings, at the Hastings encampment, about 20 to 30 people at the Crab Park encampment. And the numbers were double. So since January, we were actually able to house 90 of the approximately 200 people on Hastings encampment, getting them housing. And so there is hope. I believe there is hope. We have to find a way to get the housing. And I agree with the Housing First. Finland and other jurisdictions, they provide housing. We have to get to that place. We have 330 units coming on by June, 100 every month. We just got occupancy permit on 95 units this week. We're going to start moving people out of shelters into those units. Today, we just closed on buying Chalmers Lodge, which is 15 senior units. We're going to be able to move seniors out of SROs and move them into better units. It's going to require investment. It's going to require us to do it. But I am under no illusion that this is going to be easy, because SROs, as much as people don't like some of them, they are still an important part of the housing stock to ensure we have the housing people need. So not only do we have to build the housing for people to move them into different housing, then we have to go and probably move away from SRO model, and that's going to take some years to do. So that's a long answer just to say it's a complicated problem, but we're not shying away from it. And we knew when we said, hey, we're going to do it, people are going to come to you and say, you said you were going to fix it. Why haven't you fixed it yet? 5 months later. But people have the right to do so, because I think everybody wants to see these folks get housing. And the reason why we stepped up was we don't think that's dignified for people to live that way. And we think it's that we need to do more. So there's a lot of work that's been happening. There's a lot more coming, but it's tied directly to the things that your organization has been advocating for, which is when you don't have enough housing for people, they're going to move. It's going to put pressure, downward pressure on all communities. And so all of these things have to be addressed together, not as silos and independent.
Absolutely. I think Abundant Housing Vancouver would agree that housing supply is a key issue. It's a central issue because it makes it difficult or impossible to solve the other dysfunctions we see in our housing system. But I see we're running out of time. Okay. So I just want to, I know it's, I try to get through as many questions as I could. Thank you for everybody who sent them in. I did my best. I want to thank everybody. I'll give the minister a chance for sort of final comments in just a moment, but I really do want to thank everybody for showing up. And, we didn't have time to solve the housing crisis tonight, of course, but I do really want to urge everybody to stay engaged and keep this conversation going in your community, with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues. Carry on the conversation with Abundant Housing Vancouver. Please sign up for our email list if you haven't already. But there's other great organizations working on the housing crisis from different perspectives, working on different issues. I think the main thing is to keep engaged and to help keep our elected leaders leaders accountable and keep the pressure on them to make sure they understand how central housing is to our society and how bad shape we're in. So thank you to the minister. I really appreciated this chance to chat with you. Thank you to you all. Thanks to Owen Brady, who from Abundant Housing Vancouver, who really took the lead on organizing this. Jordan Ross for his help with the technology, and everyone else. One way to keep the conversation going is me and a few other people I know are going to the St. Regis Bar, just a couple blocks away at on Granville and Dunsmuir. Reservation under my name, Peter Waldkirch. I would love to meet more people. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll give the closing remarks to the minister.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you, Owen. And Jordan, I'll thank you after I see the video. Just kidding. Thank you, my friend. And thank all of you for being here. It's nice to see some familiar faces and also some new faces. We'll have a chance to chat with some of you after. And thanks to Abundant Housing for having the conversation and keeping us accountable, as you said. I think that it's going to be vitally important for us as we take on some of the challenges we have, is to have conversations with those that are not converted. Have the conversations with people who are not there yet. Give people room to not necessarily agree, because that's the only way we're going to be able to bring people along in this journey. If we have conversations and we shut people down, what will happen is that'll just further entrench them and make this challenge even greater. And so that's my ask of all of you, is just to engage people, push them on their thinking, but make sure you give them space to be part of this, because I think everyone deep down, as I said, understands why we need to do it. And we just need to remind people of why we're doing this, which is to ensure future generations can have the same opportunities the generations before them had. And so with that, thank you. Thank you for being here today, and look forward to engaging with all of you again in the near future.
Too late.